T.S. Eliot once said of Philip Larkin that he often makes words do what he wants. That to me is a huge understatement. What Larkin does with words is both simple and devastatingly effective. As a schoolboy, I was thrilled with the idea that a poet would use swear words in his work. And I loved the directness of his poems, how he used everyday experiences to reveal something profound. He would painstakingly decode Chaucer, Milton and Shakespeare, making little notes in the margins like classical allusion and literary reference. You rarely have to do that with Larkin's work. I keep a copy of his selected poems by my bed and always travel with it. If I'm feeling old and regretful, I might read High Windows, with its beautiful final verse. Rather than words comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air, that shows nothing, and is nowhere, and is endless. Or if I am lying in bed, awake at night fearing death, I will turn to Aubade, unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible but how and where and when I shall myself die. Or if I want to laugh, I might read Self's the Man. Oh, no one can deny that Arnold is less selfish than I. He married a woman to stop her getting away. Now she's there all day. I know how Larkin's poems make me feel, but I don't know how they work. So to try and get closer to both Larkin and his poems, I went to talk to Sir Andrew Motion, the former Poet Laureate, and author of the definitive Larkin biography. So Andrew, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me about Larkin. Now, having written Biography of Larkin, how important do you think his life story is when you look at the poetry?
It's extremely important, though you immediately want to say that the connection between a writer's life and their work is both intimate and separate. Philip himself says a very interesting thing about the way in which we value poetry because it doesn't merely react to life, it acts on it. And I think we can see that in his own case very clearly. A lot of the poems that we find in the collected poems are ones which it is possible to trace back to some event or other. And yet you can't rely on the event itself to be the whole occasion of the poem. The transfigurations of art have to happen.
My mother, who hates thunderstorms, holds up each summer day and shakes it out suspiciously, lest swarms of grape-dark clouds are lurking there. But when the August weather breaks and rains begin, and brittle frost sharpens the bird-abandoned air, her worried summer look is lost. And I, her son, though summer-born and summer-loving, nonetheless am easier when the leaves are gone. Too often summer days appear emblems of perfect happiness I can't confront. I must await a time less bold, less rich, less clear, an autumn more appropriate.
This is a poem called Mother Summer Eye, which is quite an early poem, and it paints quite a bleak portrait of his life with his mother and the fact that neither of them seem to be of a happy disposition.
That's right. I mean, it's a very interesting poem about fusspottery, really, isn't it? And I think that Eva Larkin, his mother, was a tremendous fusspot. She's a person who appears in the poem as somebody who is always anticipating the worst that could be.
And this bleak childhood where a family didn't seem to communicate with each other, how important was that, do you think, in shaping his work?
I think he felt, in some sense, stuck between a father whom he identified with very much, highly efficient, highly organised, very clever dad, whose politics are rather notoriously right-wing, an admirer of Hitler, somebody who kept on his mantelpiece a little model of Hitler that when you pressed the button in its base snapped into a Nazi salute, apparently without irony.
Well, we've all got one of those.
Speak for yourself.
But also because Larkin, it's shocking actually how right-wing he is. Partly because you think, well, an artist, you sort of expect them somehow to be left-wing.
You kind of do, don't you? Though, of course, you look over the 20th century and you realise that modernists who might be very left-leaning in their aesthetics, if you can put it like that, turn out often to be rather right-wing in their politics. Just about this poem, I think that there is something sort of preemptively gloomy about it. But I also think, as we say that it's very interestingly acute in its anticipations of what becomes a major theme in him, which is how ordinary domestic uncertainties and, in their extreme form, unhappinesses create a template on which great art can be built. One of the characteristics of Larkin's poems, one of the reasons that people value the poems as they do, is importantly to do with the fact that the situations they describe are not extreme. In fact, on the contrary, they're absolutely familiar. There is also something in the poem that anticipates a lot that's important in the later work around too often summer days appear emblems of perfect happiness I can't confront. I must await a time less bold, less rich, less clear. Which, if you think about it purely in terms of biography, seems the description of a disappointed life. But if you then think about how that life produced the work that we value and which will always be valued as long as people read poems, because these poems are so good, I think it forces you to say that he devised a life, unhappy as it may often have been, which was a kind of perfect vehicle for him to write in.
Do you admire the work of Morrissey?
I was slightly too old to get him
First time round.
So there's an element of research in my interest in Morrissey, but I think I know what you're going to say.
Well, only that I'm a massive Morrissey fan, and there seems to be a connection with Larkin. But whereas Larkin, he remained in Hull, remained a poet, not earning much money, never getting married. Morrissey was very successful, moved to Los Angeles. It's harder now for Morrissey to write a lyric about a bleak life.
That's right.
Obviously, he may, in his soul, in his heart, he may still feel alone. But with Larkin, it feels like, he began his days, they were bleak. He ended his days in a bleak fashion.
For Sidney Bechet, that note you hold, narrowing and rising, shakes like New Orleans reflected on the water, and in all ears appropriate falsehood wakes, building for some a legendary quarter of balconies, flower baskets and quadrilles, everyone making love and going shares. Oh, play that thing. Mute, glorious Storyvilles others may license, grouping round their chairs sporting house girls like circus tigers priced far above rubies to pretend they're fads, while scholars manqués nod around unnoticed, wrapped up in personnels like old plaids. On me your voice falls, as they say love should, like an enormous yes. My crescent city is where your speech alone is understood, and greeted as the natural noise of good, scattering long-haired grief and scored pity.
I like this poem because, mainly for there's such a beautiful line, on me your voice falls, as they say love should, like an enormous yes. It doesn't quite fit into the ideas we necessarily have about Larkin, and that here he is celebrating a jazz musician.
A lot of my most treasured memories of time that I spent with him were of sitting in his house, listening to jazz music, and the enormous yes that lies, and I think you're completely right about this, at the heart of this poem is something which people tend not to pay enough attention to because they're so preoccupied by the idea of him being Eeyore-ish or gloomy.
Well, you think of him as kind of writing a poem about an enormous no.
Exactly,
but here it's a yes.
Or maybe an enormous perhaps.
Yeah.
But not really, he's not the man from Del Monte.
No.
And this is a poem about the man from Del Monte. But it's also very interestingly a poem in which that great affirmation is surrounded by marks of expertise in the jazz world, references to the legendary quarter of New Orleans in which Sidney Bechet prospered, Storyville, the Sporting House Girls. What's interesting about this poem is that he quite boldly says to his readers, I'm going to use a lot of effectively jargon here, jazz references, and if you don't like it, you've got to have to lump it and catch up. And it doesn't really matter if you can't be bothered to do it, because in the middle of it there's something absolutely clear, which is to do with love and its enormous yes.
First sight. Lambs that learn to walk in snow, when their bleating clouds the air, meet a vast unwelcome, know nothing but a sunless glare. Newly stumbling to and fro, all they find outside the fold is a wretched width of cold. As they wait beside the ewe, her fleeces wetly caked, there lies hidden round them, waiting too, earth's immeasurable surprise. They could not grasp it if they knew what so soon will wake and grow utterly unlike the snow.
When I was first wooing my wife, sometimes I would read her poems that I really loved, and this is one that I would read to her because it felt to be about the wonderful power of love and how different the world can look when you're in love. And so I asked my best man to read it at my wedding. The end of the first line is snow, and the end of the last line is snow. It feels like a perfect circle to me, but like the Beatles yesterday, it feels sort of absolutely, it moves and ends.
First Sight is very much a poem you feel Wordsworth would have recognised the value, in as much as it's to do with the cyclical rewards of nature and the quiet ways in which nature's returns allow us to feel that we are rejuvenated ourselves in some way, and yet always very carefully framed with questions and qualifications. Earth's immeasurable surprise. They could not grasp it if they knew what so soon would wake and grow utterly unlike the snow. So there's a kind of affirmation and also a reminder that the creatures who are observing this affirmation are ignorant of it.
Which kind of brings us on to his complicated relationships with women. He never married. Was he denying himself the pleasure of being married, or do you think he just didn't want to be married?
I think he felt a mixture of self-doubt and self-disparagement, which coincided with a feeling derived from goodness knows what in his sort of gene bank, as well as from things in his reading, like Cyril Connolly, for instance, that to be in an orthodox-looking marriage would be the death of his poems. It's the pram in the hall anxiety. And those two areas of feeling, combined with a genuine sort of shyness in him and enjoyment of his own company, to produce a life that was at one and the same time fiercely independent and depended on its independence for the poems, but at the same time shot through with tendernesses and sort of lurching feelings about other people that were forever pulling it out of the shape that he wanted it to adopt. So I think it was pretty painful.
A poem he wrote, which is to some extent about marriage, his maiden name, which again is quite an early poem that I love.
Marrying left your maiden name disused. Its 5 light sounds no longer mean your face, your voice, and all your variants of grace. For since you were so thankfully confused by law with someone else, you cannot be semantically the same as that young beauty. It was of her that these 2 words were used. Now it's a phrase applicable to no one, lying just where you left it, scattered through old lists, old programs, a school prize or 2, packets of letters tied with tartan ribbon. Then is it scentless, weightless, strengthless, wholly untruthful? Try whispering it slowly. No, it means you. Or since you're past and gone, it means what we feel now about you then. How beautiful you were, and near, and young. So vivid, you might still be there among those first few days, unfinger-marked again. So your old name shelters our faithfulness, instead of losing shape and meaning less with your depreciating luggage laden.
It's a very unusual thing to write a poem about, isn't it, about a maiden name?
It is, while at the same time I can imagine a poem being written on this subject by Thomas Hardy. It's always seemed to me rather Hardy-esque, beautifully Hardy-esque. It's full of the most beautiful sort of tendernesses about how character is found and lost by the changing of names. And actually, as we go into the last 2 or 3 lines of the poem, I think it darkens because it's getting sombre here, but also I think other things are creeping into the poem that begins so freshly, so openly, so generously about this idea, but closes for me with a sort of faint drumbeat of other stuff going on in it. Ideas of control creep in, as though he wants to keep control of the person whose life it is before she changed her name, as though he might have some rights on her previous existence. Unfinger-marked casts a pretty cold eye, doesn't it, on what it is to be fingered.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable image,
There
really,
is something
isn't it?
painful
Yeah.
here, I think, and sort of soiled about it. Unfinger-marked again, so your old name shelters our faithfulness. Well, what's he being faithful to? He's being faithful to the idea of a woman who's, in some sense, not allowed to change, instead of losing shape and meaning less. Well, to be married, I mean, we were just talking about marriage. To be married is not to lose shape and mean less, inevitably, unless you're Larkin looking at it from the outside. And in the same way, the luggage that we begin to carry around with us as we get older in our later lives with our marriages and so on, doesn't necessarily depreciate either. In fact, it might be rather enriching.
There's another poem, Self's the Man, which deals with a similar theme but in a much more comic way.
Oh, no one can deny that Arnold is less selfish than I. He married a woman to stop her getting away. Now she's there all day. And the money he gets for wasting his life on work, she takes as her perk, to pay for the kiddie's clobber and the dryer and the electric fire. And when he finishes supper, planning to have a read at the evening paper, it's put a screw in this wall. He has no time at all, with the nippers to wheel round the houses and the hall to paint in his old trousers, and that letter to her mother saying, "Won't you come for the summer?" To compare his life and mine makes me feel a swine. Oh, no one can deny that Arnold is less selfish than I. But wait, not so fast. Is there such a contrast? He was out for his own ends, not just pleasing his friends. And if it was such a mistake, he still did it for his own sake, playing his own game. So he and I are the same. Only I'm a better hand at knowing what I can stand without them sending a van. Or I suppose I can.
He married a woman to stop her getting away. Now she's there all day. Which has always made me laugh.
Yeah, me too.
And he's really weighing up, well, would my life be any better if I was married? He seems to think he'd be unhappy in either scenario.
Yes.
And he's just
Yes.
weighing up
I think that's
two
right,
different
isn't it?
types of
I think
unhappiness.
that's right, yes.
I think this is a kind of discourse with himself.
Well, it is very interesting about the way the poems work, that they often propose an argument, don't they, which they then resolve.
Another poem which I really like, I mean, it's only 4 lines long, Administration, always makes me laugh. Day by day your estimation clocks up. Who deserves a smile and who a frown? And girls you have to tell to pull their socks up are those whose pants you'd most like to pull down. So this seems to be the sort of pervy Larkin.
You read it sort of half awake and you think it's one kind of poem. And then you realise that the situation here is that it's being spoken by somebody who's, what are they doing? They're running an organisation. I mean, let's say they're running a library, for instance.
In Hull.
Let's say they're running a library in Hull.
The chief librarian.
And the first 2 lines, day by day your estimation clocks up, who deserves a smile and who a frown, completely sort of uncontroversial. That's exactly how anybody who's run anything behaves in relation to it. You notice who's doing their job properly and who isn't, who you like and who you don't. But the next 2 lines, and girls you have to tell to pull their socks up and those whose pants you'd most like to pull down, this is a completely different sort of behaviour, isn't it? It's a very, very significant gear shift between...
Well, it paints a picture of someone who, on the surface of it, seems very proper and going about their
Yes.
job in a completely respectable way, but is having these thoughts.
That's right. So the first 2 lines are above the surface and the second 2 lines are below the surface.
But that seems like quite a good image of him.
I think that's exactly right.
In that you think of him as this respectable... You see the pictures of him, this is like a literary Eric Morecambe, and
Yes.
he looks kind of serious, doesn't he, with his bald head and his
Exactly.
glasses. And yet he's capable
Yes.
of expressing thoughts that most of us would be uncomfortable expressing.
Yes, the thing that struck me about being in his company was that he never, ever hesitated to say the things which most people would either not say at all or only say when
So
they
he
were...
would say them in conversation,
Yeah.
not just in a letter.
Absolutely.
The mower stalled twice. Kneeling, I found a hedgehog jammed up against the blades. Killed. It had been in the long grass. I had seen it before, and even fed it once. Now I had mauled its unobtrusive world unmendably. Burial was no help. Next morning I got up, and it did not. The first day after a death, the new absence is always the same. We should be careful of each other. We should be kind while there is still time.
Another poem of his that I've loved, that I actually read at my grandma's funeral, called The Mower. I read it because it has a really beautiful sentiment. We should be careful of each other, we should be kind while there is still time. But because it's a poem about him accidentally killing a hedgehog, my family all looked at me, because I think they thought I was comparing my dead grandmother to a hedgehog. And as soon as I'd read the poem, I regretted it, but I still believe it is.
Yes, I'm sorry you felt that. But I don't think you should regret it at all. I mean, I think it was a beautiful choice to have made. Like so many of the poems, it moves from this absolutely recognisable, familiar sort of thing. I mean, I don't mean that everybody in the world has chewed up a hedgehog in their mower, but I do mean a lot of people have little gardens, and a lot of people have mowers, and a lot of people have hedgehogs in their garden. So out of this comes this drama, which takes us to somewhere that is on a much higher plane. It's about how we as human beings need to be true and kind and careful with one another.
But he again creates a very simple image and then makes a really profound point.
But I do think it's possible in Philip's case to say that he was somebody who was always, well, not always, but invariably looking for a way of making a general and memorable truth about a particular and familiar situation.
This takes us to Aubade, which, interestingly, relatively long poem about death, and ends with a very simple, everyday image.
Aubade. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation. Yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse. The good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and may never, but at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon, nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid no trick dispels. Religion used to try, that vast, moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die, and specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel, not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anaesthetic from which none come round. And so it stays just on the edge of vision, a small unfocused blur, a standing chill that slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen. This one will. And realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we are caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined at than withstood. Slowly, light strengthens, and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe, what we know, have always known. Know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked-up offices, and all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay, with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house.
It's a really marvellous poem, this. Probably one of the greatest poems about death in the language, and our language is full of very good poems about death. And an amazing sort of summation of his life as a writer, I think.
What I love is that towards the end of the poem, he's basically saying life is going on. He describes the world as rented, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah.
Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. So there he's creating a very everyday image of a postman, and yet he's saying they're like doctors, and doctors you associate with death.
People bringing you bad news, exactly. And of course he only had about 7 years to live after the publication of this, and had long been fixated by the idea it was going to die at the same age as his father, which he did. So it is a poem written with an insight of the grave, I think. But it also links what's presented as a highly individual anxiety and dread to the world itself, which, as he said in many previous poems, offers certain sorts of consolation. I mean, the world does help us deal with these things, as we know, and yet doesn't deny it or suppress it enough to push it out of our minds entirely.
And why was he so fixated on death?
Well, that's a question.
Well, he didn't seem to like life that much, and yet he was terrified of death.
I've always been very struck by this, I must say. You would think that somebody who really didn't like life would be very happy to live in the blankness that he abominates here. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anaesthetic from which none come round. I mean, all that seems to me hard evidence of somebody who loves life. So all our accounts of Larkin as this melancholy person, or the account which is generally given of him as a melancholy person, who is always on the side of death, is always saying no, or at best, perhaps, does need to be challenged, I think, by the idea that this poem consecrates of him being somebody whose fearfulness and dread about the end of life is, in fact, and paradoxically, a measure of how much he loves it.
Sir Andrew Motion was talking to David Walliams about the work of Philip Larkin.